It was 2 a.m. when the sudden loud banging at Marcus's door shattered the silence of his modest apartment. He had been asleep, lost in a deep slumber after a long day of studying case files for his law degree. The knock came first, then a pounding that rattled the thin walls of the apartment. Marcus's heart raced as he jolted awake, his mind struggling to process the disturbance. His eyes flickered to the clock on his nightstand. 2 a.m. It felt like a nightmare. Groggy, Marcus reached for his glasses and slipped them on, squinting at the door. The noise outside wasn't the usual sound of a neighbor arguing or the faint hum of city traffic. No, this was different. This was forceful. This was urgent. He got up, his body stiff from the unanticipated wakefulness, and walked toward the door, trying to calm his pulse. What was going on? He checked the peephole but saw nothing, just shadows moving in the hallway. He hesitated. Something wasn't right. He moved back to the door, pressing his back against the wood, hoping whatever it was would go away. Then came the loud, sharp command, echoing down the hall. "This is the police. Open the door." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. His breath caught in his throat. Why were the police here? Was there a mistake? He wasn't involved in anything illegal. His apartment was small and he kept to himself. Books, case studies, and long hours were his only company. There was no reason for the police to come barging into his life at 2 a.m. Marcus stood still, torn between confusion and dread. The officers on the other side of the door weren't giving him a choice. Another round of pounding came, louder and more forceful this time. "We're coming in." The voice on the other side was firm, unyielding. Before he could respond, the sound of metal breaking through the door frame sent a shockwave through him. The door swung open. 2 police officers stormed in, their eyes sharp, their hands on their holsters. One officer, tall and built, moved first, his gun trained on Marcus. "On the ground." The officer barked. Marcus's mind raced. He could hardly process what was happening. Panic rose in his chest. This wasn't how he imagined his life going. This wasn't the future he'd worked so hard for. He had to think fast. His thoughts raced back to the many nights he had spent studying for his law degree. How he'd spent countless hours breaking through the barriers of a system that often worked against people like him. He had come from a background that told him he wouldn't make it, an environment that doubted his potential because of his skin color. But now here he was, a man trying to be more than just his circumstances. And yet, here were the police, treating him like any other suspect. As the officer's gun pressed toward his chest, Marcus stood frozen. His mind screamed to act, but his body felt like it was in a vice. His hands raised instinctively, palms facing the officers. He didn't want to make any sudden moves. There was no telling how they might react. "Who are you?" The other officer, a heavier-set man with a stony face, demanded. His voice was gruff, as if he had been through this countless times before. Marcus swallowed hard. His voice came out shakier than he wanted, but he managed to speak. "I'm Marcus. Marcus Williams. What's going on? Why are you—" "We got a tip. Someone reported suspicious activity. We need to make sure you're not involved." The first officer cut him off, his gun never leaving its aim. A flood of confusion hit Marcus. He had no idea what they were talking about. There was no suspicious activity here. His life was anything but suspicious. He worked hard every day trying to better himself, trying to make a life beyond the limitations set by others. As the officers moved in, their eyes scanning the apartment with clinical detachment, Marcus stood there in his pajamas, disoriented, unsure of what to say. His heart pounded in his ears, and the hum of the night outside seemed a distant memory. All that mattered now was the tension in the room, the weight of the officers' stares, the coldness in their approach. "Is this a mistake?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've done nothing wrong." The officers glanced at each other, and for a moment Marcus thought they might take his word for it. But then one of the officers spotted something hanging on the wall behind Marcus. His eyes flicked to it, then back to Marcus. It was his robe, the judge's robe. It hung there proudly, draped neatly over a coat hanger. A lifetime of hard work, of struggling through law school, of defying expectations, all symbolized in that simple black robe. It was more than just a piece of clothing. It was the symbol of Marcus's journey. The robe had taken years of determination, overcoming the odds stacked against him. It was a reminder of his accomplishments, a sign that he was someone who had earned respect through his own effort, not someone who could be dismissed or judged based on stereotypes. The officer's gaze lingered on the robe for a moment. His lips parted slightly as if he were trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The silence in the room thickened. The other officer glanced at his partner, confusion flickering in his eyes. There was something about the robe that changed the air in the room. They were no longer looking at the same man they had walked in to arrest. The tension shifted. The officers relaxed their stances, lowering their weapons slightly, their confusion turning into curiosity. Marcus noticed the change and used the opportunity to speak again. "I'm a law student," he said, his voice stronger now. "That robe? It's not just for show. It's my dream. It's a symbol of what I've been working toward." The officers looked at each other. The shift in their demeanor was almost imperceptible, but it was there. They were no longer treating Marcus as a criminal, but as someone who deserved respect. One of the officers cleared his throat awkwardly. We didn't realize," he muttered. Marcus nodded, his pulse still racing but his words becoming steadier. "I understand, but I've worked my entire life to get to this point. I've worked harder than anyone knows. And that robe? It's a symbol of everything I've overcome." For a moment, the two officers stood there in silence, processing what Marcus had just said. Marcus's words hung in the air, quiet but powerful. The robe on the wall now told a story. His story, and it was impossible to ignore. The heavy silence stretched on, the weight of the situation shifting from fear to understanding, as the officers slowly realized they had misjudged the man standing before them. The room felt unnervingly still, the only sound the ticking of a distant clock. The officers stood in the same spot, staring at Marcus as if trying to piece together what they had just discovered. For a moment, it was as if the entire world had paused. The tension that had once thickened the air now seemed to dissolve, replaced by something else, an unfamiliar sense of uncertainty. Marcus remained motionless, still processing the realization that his life, his years of sacrifice and hard work, were being examined under a microscope in this moment of unexpected confrontation. But there was a strange sense of power in that robe hanging on the wall. He could feel it. It was no longer just a symbol of his personal ambition. It had become something larger, a representation of everything he had fought for. The journey of a man who refused to be defined by his past, his race, or the stereotypes society had tried to impose on him. One of the officers, the taller one, shifted his weight uncomfortably. His hand moved to his belt but not to his weapon. It seemed like he was about to speak but hesitated as if unsure of the words. After a long pause, he finally let out a deep breath. "So, you're actually a judge?" The officer's voice was quieter now, more uncertain than before. His words were simple, but they carried a weight, as though he was trying to reconcile the image of Marcus standing before him with the image of the man he had come to arrest. Marcus didn't rush to answer. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath, collecting his thoughts. "I'm not a judge yet," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm studying law, working toward becoming one. That robe you see hanging on the wall is the same one I'll wear when I finally reach my goal. It's a reminder of the work I've put in, the dreams I'm chasing, and the obstacles I've had to overcome." The officers exchanged glances, a momentary flicker of disbelief passing between them. The room felt heavy, as if the entire world outside had fallen away. It wasn't that they didn't believe him, it was more like they didn't know what to believe. The truth they had arrived with, the story they had been told, was crumbling in front of them. The heavier officer, the one who had been silent until now, cleared his throat and finally spoke. "We didn't know. We were just doing our job. We thought we were going after someone who fit a certain profile." Marcus could feel the weight of those words. He understood what they were saying. The police officers had come in with their own assumptions, their own biases, their own judgments, based not on facts or evidence but on appearances. And because of those assumptions, they had treated him like a criminal before even knowing who he was. "I get it," Marcus replied, his voice steady, the hurt in his heart now buried beneath a layer of calm. "I know how people like me are often viewed, but I'm not what you think I am. I've never been what you think I am." The officer who had spoken first looked at him, his face softening. "Yeah, we didn't see it. We only saw what we expected to see." "It's not just you," Marcus replied. "It's the way we're all conditioned to see things. We all have biases, whether we know it or not. But that doesn't mean we can't change. That doesn't mean we can't do better." The first officer, still looking at Marcus with newfound respect, nodded. "You're right. We're not perfect, but this is a wake-up call." Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a smile of satisfaction. It was a smile of understanding, the kind that comes from knowing the battle was never truly about winning. It was about changing hearts and minds, one person at a time. He had no illusions that this moment would change everything, but it was a step in the right direction. He wasn't just standing there as a man with a dream anymore. He was standing as a symbol of hope, of resilience, and of the possibility of change. The officers stood there for a few more moments, their words lost in the weight of what they had learned. Marcus didn't need them to apologize. He didn't need them to make excuses. All he needed was for them to understand that he too was human, that he too was worthy of respect. And as the officers turned to leave, the tension in the room slowly melted away, replaced by something more powerful: understanding. "Good luck with everything," the first officer said, his voice genuine. Marcus nodded, watching as they left his apartment, their footsteps fading into the distance. He didn't feel angry anymore. He didn't feel afraid. He felt something different: hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Maybe people could see beyond the surface and begin to understand what it meant to truly live in a world where judgment was no longer based on assumptions, but on who someone truly was. And with that, he turned toward the robe hanging on the wall, a symbol of his past, present, and future. The journey wasn't over, but it had taken a step forward that night. The officers had left, the door now cracked open behind them, the quiet of the night creeping back into the apartment. But Marcus couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. The adrenaline that had coursed through his veins was now fading, replaced by a strange emptiness that lingered in the air. His eyes scanned the room, but everything felt distant, almost surreal. The robe on the wall still hung there, a symbol of his years of hard work. But now it seemed like a stranger to him. It was as though the robe had lost its meaning in the blink of an eye, stripped of its significance by the very people who were supposed to uphold justice. Marcus stood in the middle of the room, motionless, his body still tense from the encounter. He felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion settling in. But it wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental, as though everything he had been fighting for, all the long hours of study, all the sacrifices he had made, had just come crashing down in a single moment. His mind kept replaying the officers' faces, their shock when they saw the robe. He knew they hadn't seen him, not the real him. They had seen the man they wanted to see, the man they had expected to see, and for a moment, he had been just another statistic, just another case of mistaken identity. But now, in the silence of his apartment, with the door slowly closing behind him, he couldn't help but wonder, was this how it was always going to be? Was his entire life going to be a series of moments like this? His worth questioned, his motives misunderstood, all because of the color of his skin? It was a thought that lingered, a gnawing sense of doubt creeping in, threatening to overshadow everything he had worked so hard to achieve. He looked again at the robe, still hanging there in its place, and for a moment it seemed to mock him. The weight of it pressed on his chest, a constant reminder of the expectations he had placed on himself, the expectations that society had placed on him. He wasn't just a man with a dream anymore. He was a symbol of struggle, of defiance, of something bigger than himself. He had always known that, but in that moment, he wasn't sure if it was worth it anymore. It wasn't until he sat down, rubbing his eyes in frustration, that he realized the real question wasn't whether the robe meant something, it was whether he still believed in it. Did he still believe in the path he had chosen, the dream that had carried him through years of hardship? Or was he just chasing something that no longer had meaning, something that had become tainted by the very system he had once hoped to change? The questions gnawed at him, but he knew better than to dwell on them for too long. Marcus had never been one to give in to doubt. It was part of his nature. He had been told he wouldn't amount to much more than the streets he grew up on. He had been told that people like him didn't make it in law school, let alone in a courtroom, but he had proved them all wrong. Every day, every hour of study, every night spent poring over textbooks, every sacrifice he made, it had been worth it. He had made it this far, and no one, not even the officers who had barged into his home, could take that from him. The sound of a phone ringing pulled him from his thoughts. Marcus glanced over at the counter, where his cell phone sat, its screen flashing with a call from his mother. He hesitated for only a moment before walking over and picking it up. "Marcus, baby, are you okay?" Her voice came through full of concern, as always. He could hear the faint hum of the television in the background, a distraction he knew she used to mask her worries. "I'm fine, Ma," Marcus said, forcing a smile even though he knew she couldn't see it. "Just a little shaken up, but I'm okay." "Shaken up? What happened?" She paused, her tone shifting. "Did something happen to you?" "I heard the sirens outside. It was nothing. The police, they just made a mistake," he replied, cutting her off. He didn't want to get into the details. His mother had always been the kind to worry, and he didn't want to add to that burden. She had already carried enough over the years. "Marcus, you need to be careful. You can't trust them. You've worked too hard for this. You can't let them bring you down," she said, her voice firm but with a hint of fear that she couldn't quite hide. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking in her words. She was right. She had always been right, and he had learned the hard way that the world wasn't going to give him anything, but he had never let that stop him before. He had fought for his place in this world, and he would keep fighting. "I know, Ma," he said, his voice steady now. "I know. I'm not going to let this define me. It's been a long road, and sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it." Her silence on the other end of the line told him everything he needed to know. She had heard it before, the doubt, the frustration, the exhaustion that came with every step of the journey. It was the same for everyone, but for people like him, it felt heavier. "Marcus, you've come so far," she said, her voice soft now, comforting. "Don't you dare forget that. You've worked for everything you have. You've earned it, and no matter what anyone says or does, they can't take that away from you." Her words resonated with him, grounding him in the moment. He had earned it, all of it. The robe on the wall, the education, the sacrifices, the struggles. None of it had been handed to him. It had been hard won, and no one, not even the officers who had come to his door, could take that away. "I won't forget," Marcus replied, his voice steady now, more certain. "I'm not going to let this stop me." After a few more words of encouragement from his mother, the conversation ended. Marcus stood there for a few moments, his phone still in his hand, before he set it back down on the counter. His thoughts were clearer now, the fog of doubt lifting as he realized something important. The robe on the wall wasn't just a symbol of his struggle. It was a reminder of his strength. He had fought for it, and he would continue to fight. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more obstacles, more moments of doubt. But Marcus knew one thing for sure. He wasn't giving up. Not now, not ever. He walked back to the wall, his gaze falling on the robe once more. This time there was no hesitation. There was no fear. There was only resolve. The robe represented the path he had chosen, the person he had become, and the person he was still becoming. With a steady hand, he reached up and adjusted it slightly, making sure it hung just right. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. It was his way of reminding himself that no matter what the world threw at him, he was still standing. He was still moving forward, and with that, he took a deep breath, turned toward the door, and walked out into the night, ready to face whatever came next. The days after the officers left Marcus's apartment were quieter than he had expected. The adrenaline of that chaotic night had worn off, but the impact it left behind lingered like an unshakable fog. The questions, the doubts, they continued to swirl in his mind, but now there was a strange clarity that seemed to come with them. The world he had been fighting to change, the systems he had hoped to be a part of, they had all collided in that moment with the force of reality, and Marcus, despite it all, had emerged with a renewed sense of purpose. He had always known the road ahead would be difficult. After all, it was never meant to be easy. But that night, when his dreams were threatened, he realized that the obstacles weren't just physical. They were deeply embedded in every facet of the world around him. But what struck him most was the strange, almost surreal nature of that encounter with the officers. They had come into his home with preconceived notions, armed with assumptions that had been formed without knowing the real story. He wasn't the man they thought he was, but in that moment when they saw the robe, when they saw what he was truly working toward, it forced them to confront something much bigger than just a simple case of mistaken identity. It was about the stereotypes that had shaped their perceptions of people like him, people who had always been seen as outcasts, as troublemakers, as people to be feared. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the greater truth of how the world operated, how bias and prejudice colored the way society treated individuals. And for the first time, Marcus understood just how deep those biases ran. It wasn't enough to simply rise above them. He had to shatter them to expose them for what they were. But he couldn't do that alone. The weight of it all settled on him like a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. And yet, he knew he had no choice but to try. Marcus had spent his entire life fighting to be seen as more than the world's assumptions. His parents had instilled in him the belief that his future could be whatever he wanted it to be, that he wasn't defined by where he came from or the color of his skin. But it wasn't until that moment, in the silence of his apartment after the officers had left, that he truly understood the magnitude of what he was up against. This wasn't just about proving his worth to himself or to his family. It was about proving it to a world that often didn't want to see him at all. He found himself thinking about the robe again. Not the physical garment, but what it represented. The years of struggle, the rejection, the moments of doubt that had tried to define him. It wasn't just fabric. It was a testament to everything he had fought for. The robe was the marker of a dream that had been so hard won, a symbol of the person he had become in the face of adversity. But now, as he sat in his apartment, the robe hanging on the wall before him, Marcus wondered if it was enough. Had the officers seen beyond their assumptions in that moment? Or had they simply been caught off guard by the unexpected, by the revelation that a man they had believed to be guilty of something he hadn't done could actually be working toward something as noble as becoming a judge? He didn't know. What he did know was that the road to that robe wasn't going to be paved with sympathy or understanding. It wasn't going to be easy, and no one would hand it to him. He would have to fight for it every step of the way. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was quick, sharp, and unexpected. Marcus stood up from his chair, his mind immediately shifting back to that night. He didn't know what to expect this time, but whatever it was, he wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions again. He walked toward the door, taking a deep breath before pulling it open. Standing in front of him was Officer Daniels, the one who had been most silent during the raid. He looked different now. There was no uniform, no authoritative presence that usually came with the badge. Instead, he looked like a man burdened with something he didn't fully understand, something that had been weighing on him long after he had left Marcus's apartment. "Marcus," Daniel said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" Marcus didn't say anything at first. He just stood there looking at the officer, the man who had once barged into his home pointing a gun at him like he was just another criminal, was now standing before him, not as an officer of the law, but as a man who seemed to be wrestling with something inside himself. Daniels took a step forward, his eyes filled with an unfamiliar sense of discomfort. I've been thinking about what happened, and I don't know, maybe I owe you an apology." His words hung in the air, awkward and unfinished, as though he wasn't sure how to say what needed to be said. Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised. He hadn't expected this. Not from someone who had been so sure of himself that night. "An apology?" Marcus repeated, his voice steady but guarded. "For what?" "For the way we treated you," Daniels replied. He shifted on his feet, looking down for a moment before meeting Marcus's gaze again. "For assuming the worst. We got it wrong. I got it wrong." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, taking in the officer's words. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't the confrontation he had imagined. He had thought that the night would end with resentment, with more distance between them. Instead, here was this officer standing in front of him, acknowledging the mistake and, in his own way, trying to make things right. "I didn't know what to think when I saw the robe," Daniels continued, his voice softer now. "I think it took me by surprise. But I didn't stop to consider what it meant, who you were. I just saw what I thought I saw, and I didn't stop to listen." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had been prepared to hold on to the anger, the hurt. But now that the officer was here offering something Marcus had never expected, he found himself at a crossroads. It was easy to hold on to resentment. It was easier to let the anger fuel him. But now he had a choice. He could continue to hold on to the bitterness of the past, or he could listen, understand, and possibly find a way forward. "I appreciate the apology," Marcus said, his voice measured. "But it's not just about me. It's about everyone who's been through what I've been through. Everyone who's had to fight to be seen, to be heard. It's not just about one person making a mistake. It's about changing the way people see each other, changing the way people treat each other." Daniels nodded slowly, as if the weight of Marcus's words was sinking in. "You're right," he said, his voice filled with a new sense of understanding. "I've spent so much of my life seeing the world through a certain lens. But I think maybe I've been looking at it wrong all this time." Marcus didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The truth was, words could only go so far. What mattered now was what happened next. What mattered was the willingness to change, to learn, to grow. He didn't know if Officer Daniels could change overnight, but he knew that people like him, people who had experienced the world in ways others hadn't, had the power to make a difference. Marcus had learned that lesson long ago.
Now it was up to Daniels to learn it for himself. With a final nod, Marcus stepped back, giving Daniels a moment to leave.
"Take care of yourself," Marcus said. It wasn't an invitation to be friends, but a recognition that change was possible, even in the most unexpected of places. As the officer walked away, Marcus closed the door softly behind him, the weight of the conversation settling in his chest. The road was long and the fight was far from over. But Marcus felt a small flicker of hope, a sign that maybe, just maybe, things could change. He had a long way to go, but tonight had shown him something he hadn't expected. There was room for growth, even in the places he had thought were unreachable. The days that followed felt different. There was a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. Marcus went about his routine, his studies, his work, his life. But everything had changed, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. The world he had been fighting to fit into, the one he had struggled against for so many years, was beginning to look less like a battlefield and more like a place where he could actually make a difference. It wasn't that the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders or that every obstacle had magically disappeared. No, that would have been too easy. But something had clicked in him, something that made him believe even more fiercely than before that his path was worth pursuing. The encounter with Officer Daniels had lingered in his mind, playing over and over again like a song that wouldn't leave his head. It wasn't just the apology. It wasn't the sudden, unexpected shift in the officer's demeanor that had caught Marcus off guard. It was the recognition of something much deeper, something that no amount of training could have prepared Daniels for. The understanding that change wasn't just about seeing people differently. It was about seeing the world differently, through a lens of empathy, of vulnerability. It was about confronting the biases that were so deeply ingrained in every corner of society. Biases that Marcus had known his whole life, but that Daniels was just beginning to face. Marcus didn't have the answers. He didn't have all the solutions. But he did know one thing. The real fight wasn't in the courtroom. It wasn't in the books or the case studies or the legal arguments he spent so much of his time poring over. No, the real fight was in changing hearts and minds, one person at a time. It was about breaking down the walls that had been built up over years of misunderstanding, of judgment, of fear. And while he knew the road would be long and fraught with setbacks, he also knew that change was possible. The realization hit him like a sudden gust of wind. It wasn't enough to just be a part of the system. It wasn't enough to simply earn the robe and walk into a courtroom as a symbol of success. Marcus wanted to be more than that. He wanted to be someone who challenged the very system that had tried to define him, that had tried to push people like him into boxes they didn't belong in. He wanted to use the position he was working so hard to earn, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, to stand as an example of what was possible when people were given the opportunity to rise above the limitations society imposed on them. But as he sat in his apartment, looking out the window at the city that seemed so far away yet so close, Marcus couldn't ignore the voice in the back of his mind, the one that had always whispered doubts into his ear, the one that had told him it wasn't possible, that he wasn't enough. It was the same voice that had followed him for years, telling him he would never make it, that he was just another statistic, another person lost to the world's cruelty. He had learned to quiet that voice in the past, to ignore its poison, but it was still there, lurking in the corners of his thoughts, ready to strike when he let his guard down. He thought about his mother's words from that night when she had called to check on him. She had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. She had always told him that no matter what the world threw at him, he had to keep moving forward. And maybe that was the key. Maybe the fight wasn't about defeating the world or even about proving everyone wrong. Maybe it was about proving to himself that he could keep going, that he could keep believing in the things that mattered, even when the road ahead seemed impossibly long. But believing wasn't enough. Marcus knew that. Believing without action was just a dream, an empty hope. It wasn't enough to just want to make a difference. He had to show it. He had to stand up time and time again and face the challenges that would inevitably come his way. The robe on the wall wasn't just a dream. It was a symbol of everything he had to endure to get to this point, and everything he still had to overcome to make the change he wanted to see. He got up from the chair, his eyes falling on the robe once again. It was still there, hanging quietly, a silent reminder of the man he was becoming. He walked over to it, his fingers grazing the fabric as he thought about the journey ahead. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people who had supported him, the ones who had stood by him when the world had told him he didn't belong. It was about every person who had ever been judged, underestimated, or overlooked simply because of who they were or where they came from. It was about giving them a voice, about using his position to challenge the system that had held so many down for so long. Marcus knew that change wouldn't come overnight. It wouldn't happen with a single gesture or a single act of defiance. No, change was a process, a long and painful one that required persistence, patience, and above all, courage. But he also knew that he wasn't alone in this fight. He had seen it in Officer Daniels, in the way the man had listened, in the way he had recognized his own flaws and taken the first step toward growth. It was a small gesture, a tiny crack in the armor of a system that had long been impenetrable, but it was a crack nonetheless, and Marcus couldn't help but believe that it was just the beginning. He couldn't help but believe that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to shift. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been told they couldn't achieve more, couldn't dream bigger, couldn't rise above their circumstances. If Daniels could change, if he could begin to see the world differently, then maybe the system could too. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something larger than himself. Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes still fixed on the robe. He had no illusions about how difficult the road ahead would be. He knew that there would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt ready. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the world, not of the people who would try to tear him down. He was ready to fight, ready to stand tall, and ready to prove that no matter where you come from, no matter the color of your skin, your dreams are worth fighting for. With a steady hand, Marcus reached up and adjusted the robe on the wall once more. This time it felt different. It felt right. He wasn't just putting it on for himself. He was putting it on for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had ever been dismissed, for everyone who had ever been told their dreams didn't matter. He was putting it on for them, and for the future he was determined to help build. He stepped back, took one last look at the robe, and walked out the door, ready to face whatever came next. The sun had begun its descent when Marcus stepped out into the streets. The heat of the day had waned, leaving a cooler breeze in its place. The city was quieter now, its pulse slowing as evening fell. Marcus moved through the streets with purpose, his mind racing despite the calm exterior he projected. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, but not in the way he had expected. There was no fear, no hesitation, only the weight of everything that had led him here. The encounter with Officer Daniels was still fresh in his mind, but now, instead of leaving a bitter taste, it stirred something within him. It felt like the beginning of something bigger than himself, something that could change the way the world saw people like him. He had always known that the fight wasn't just about personal success. It wasn't just about the robe or the title he hoped to earn one day. It was about breaking down the walls that divided people, about using his position to stand for something greater than himself. The robe that hung in his apartment wasn't just a symbol of his achievements. It was a promise he had made to himself, and to everyone who had ever been told they couldn't make it. But as he walked, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of reality settling in. It wasn't just the city that had to change, it was the entire system. The world he had always dreamed of being a part of, the courts, the legal system, the very institutions that were supposed to be the pillars of justice, had their own biases, their own way of seeing things. People like him, people who had been told they couldn't succeed, couldn't belong, couldn't rise above their circumstances, were often left out in the cold. Marcus had learned that the hard way. He had fought for years to carve out a space for himself, only to be met with resistance at every turn. The system wasn't built for people like him, and yet here he was, still standing, still fighting. The cool evening breeze didn't ease the weight on his shoulders. It only served to remind him that the world hadn't changed yet. The city was quieter now, but the world outside his thoughts was still full of noise, of judgment, of expectations. It wasn't enough to just dream of change. He had to live it. He had to challenge every perception, every assumption, every biased opinion that had ever been used to define him. As he walked, Marcus found himself drawn to a familiar part of the city, the courthouse. It stood in the distance, its imposing silhouette against the fading light a constant reminder of the place he had hoped to one day inhabit, the place where he could truly make a difference. But even as he neared it, his mind shifted back to that night, back to the officers who had stormed into his home. They hadn't seen him for who he was. They had seen what they expected to see. They had seen someone who didn't belong, someone who had to be guilty. The robe on the wall had forced them to confront the truth of who he was. But how many people had lived their entire lives being judged based on appearance, based on assumptions without ever getting the chance to show the world who they really were? Marcus had been given a rare chance. He had been able to show them who he was, to shift their perception, but that wasn't true for everyone. There were so many others, so many people like him, who would never get that chance. They would always be seen through the lens of the world's bias. That was the part that bothered him the most. He stopped in front of the courthouse, looking up at its grand structure. The building loomed over him, imposing and distant, yet filled with potential. This was the place where he had hoped to make a difference. The place where the robe would no longer be just a symbol of personal achievement, but a symbol of change. He had always dreamed of walking through those doors as a judge, but now, standing before them, he wondered what it would really mean. Would he be able to make a difference, or would he become just another cog in the wheel, another part of the system that had always worked against people like him? As he stood there lost in thought, a voice broke through the silence. "Marcus?" He turned, his heart skipping a beat when he saw who it was. It was Officer Daniels. He hadn't expected to see him here, not after their conversation, but here he was, walking toward him with an expression of determination. There was something different about him now. Gone was the rigid stance of the man who had once come to his door with a gun. Now Daniels moved with a quiet confidence, as though he had learned something, as though he had seen something that had changed the way he looked at the world. "What are you doing here?" Marcus asked, his voice cautious but not unfriendly. "I came to find you," Daniels replied, stopping a few feet away. His eyes held a sincerity that was hard to ignore. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about what you've been through. I wanted to tell you that I get it. Or at least I'm trying to." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything at first. He had no idea what this meant, what Daniels was trying to say. After everything that had happened, he hadn't expected the officer to show up here. Not after the apology he had already given. "I've been thinking about the way I've seen the world," Daniels continued, his gaze steady. "I've spent my whole career looking at things through a lens that never took people like you into account. People who don't fit the mold. People who get judged before they even have a chance to prove themselves. And I realized something. I was part of the problem. I was contributing to the system that made people like you feel like they didn't belong." Marcus's heart sank. He didn't know what to say. He had never expected this kind of conversation. The officer was speaking from a place of genuine reflection, and that wasn't something Marcus had seen before. It was almost too much to process. "I don't know if I can fix it," Daniels continued, his voice softer now. "But I'm trying. I want to be part of the change. I know it's not going to be easy. I know it's going to take time, but I want to do better. I want to stand with you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. It was as though the weight of what Daniels had said was too much to put into words. Marcus was caught in the quiet, unsure of how to respond. This wasn't what he had expected when he had first met Daniels. But now, standing there, he realized something. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about the change that was happening, in the world and in the people around him. Daniels' words weren't just an apology. They were a declaration that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady. "I'm not the one you need to prove anything to, Daniels. You need to prove it to yourself, but I appreciate what you're trying to do. I really do." For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there would be many more battles to fight, but tonight, in this moment, something had shifted, not just for him, but for the world around him. The first step had been taken, and though the journey was far from over, Marcus knew one thing for sure. The change he had been fighting for was real, and it was starting to happen. The days began to blur together after that evening. Marcus threw himself back into his work, but this time there was a shift in his focus. It wasn't just about studying case law or memorizing statutes. It was about understanding how every part of the system he hoped to join was intertwined with the biases, assumptions, and judgments that had so often held people like him back. The robe hanging on the wall didn't just represent a destination anymore. It wasn't merely the final achievement of years of sacrifice and discipline. Now it felt more like a compass, guiding him through a landscape that was still very much defined by a world he could no longer accept without change. His thoughts often returned to Officer Daniels. The conversation they had shared continued to echo in his mind, as if something had shifted in both of them that night. He didn't know what to make of it, but it left him with a sense of purpose that was almost tangible. The idea that someone like Daniels, someone who had been part of the system that had always worked against people like him, could change, could open his eyes to the reality of the world he had been blind to for so long, was a small but significant victory. Marcus wasn't sure how to process it, but he didn't have time to dwell on it for too long. There was too much work to be done, too many cases to study, too many people to help. But still, there were moments, quiet moments late at night when Marcus would sit in his apartment and wonder if the change he was hoping for was even possible. Was it possible to truly shift a system that had been built on the backs of people like him? Was it even possible to see justice as something more than a word, something more than a title, something more than the cold rulings that came down from the bench? The robe, his robe, had once been a symbol of what he wanted to become, a figure of authority in a system that could, in his ideal world, be trusted to be fair, to be just. But the more he studied, the more he learned, the more he realized just how fragile that ideal was. The system wasn't perfect. It was flawed. And as much as he wanted to be a part of it, to one day wear that robe and make decisions that would change lives for the better, he couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that had settled in his chest. How could he stand in judgment over others when the very system he was a part of often failed those who needed it most? He wasn't naive enough to believe that being a judge would automatically put him on the side of the right. He knew better than that. But the question remained, could he make a difference? Could one man really change anything? Or was the weight of the system simply too heavy to overcome, no matter how hard he tried? There were days when the weight felt unbearable, when he would stare at the robe, at the years of hard work and sacrifice it represented, and wonder if it was all worth it. Could he really make a dent in a system that had been this way for so long? Could he actually stand in front of a courtroom, look into the eyes of the people who came before him, and believe that he could be the one to make a difference? The thought scared him. It scared him more than he wanted to admit, because deep down he knew the truth. He knew that in order to truly be part of the change, he would have to stand up against everything he had been taught to accept. He would have to fight against the biases, the assumptions, the judgments, the very fabric of a system that was designed to favor the powerful, the privileged, and the wealthy. He would have to fight not only for the right to wear that robe, but for the right to be a part of something that could truly change lives, something that could offer real justice to those who had been denied it for so long. But as the days went by, Marcus began to realize something that he had never fully understood before. The fear, the uncertainty, it was all part of the process. He wasn't supposed to have all the answers. He wasn't supposed to have everything figured out. What mattered was that he kept moving forward. What mattered was that he didn't give up on the dream that had brought him this far, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain, even when the odds felt insurmountable. The robe, he realized, wasn't just a symbol of his future, it was a reminder of his journey. The long hours of study, the sleepless nights, the moments when he felt like he couldn't go on, when he wanted to give up and walk away. But he hadn't. He had kept going even when the world had told him it wasn't possible. And that was something no one could take away from him. He had earned his place. He had fought for it. And no matter what, he would keep fighting. One morning, as the sun crept through the blinds of his apartment, Marcus stood before the mirror, looking at his reflection. It was a strange thing seeing himself this way, an almost unrecognizable version of the man who had once doubted his own worth. The robe still hung on the wall behind him, a constant reminder of the road ahead. But now for the first time, Marcus didn't see it as just a dream. He saw it as a responsibility. A responsibility not just to himself, but to everyone who had believed in him, everyone who had fought alongside him, and everyone who had been left behind by a system that had failed them. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus continued his studies with a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just studying law to become a judge. He was studying it to change the system, to be the kind of judge who could see beyond the surface, who could see the people standing before him for who they truly were, not just as cases to be processed, but as individuals who deserved justice. The robe on the wall became more than just a symbol. It became a beacon, a guiding light that reminded him of the work still left to be done. It wasn't enough to wear the robe. It wasn't enough to simply become a part of the system. He had to be the change. He had to be the one to make sure that when people walked into his courtroom, they were seen for who they truly were. People, not just cases. That was the kind of justice he wanted to be a part of. That was the kind of judge he wanted to be. But as the weeks passed, the fear of the unknown never fully left him. The uncertainty lingered, a constant companion. It was there when he sat down to study. It was there when he looked at the robe, when he imagined himself standing before a courtroom. The fear of failure, of not being enough, of not living up to the expectations of those who had believed in him, was always there. But Marcus had learned something valuable along the way. Fear was not something to be avoided. Fear was something to be embraced. It was a sign that he was on the right path. It was a sign that he was pushing himself, growing and becoming the man he was meant to be. And with every passing day, as the fear remained, so did his resolve. He would not let it stop him. He would not let it define him. He would rise above it, as he had risen above everything else that had tried to hold him back. The robe was still there, hanging on the wall, but now, when Marcus looked at it, he didn't see it as something to be afraid of. He saw it as the culmination of everything he had fought for, and everything he still had yet to accomplish.